once Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia was Serbia's ally, so they mobilized their troops near the Serbian border just in case something were to happen. At this point, the great powers of Europe tried to urge negotiations between all parties involved, but it was too little, too late. Once the mobilization process began, other countries began to mobilize, and it was a downward spiral. At this point, Europe plunges into war, and the Great War begins. Austria mobilized its troops on the Serbian border. Russia mobilized its troops on the Serbian and German border, because Germany was Austria's ally. Germany didn't like this, so it declared war on Russia on August 1st, and because they knew that France would get involved, they just declared war on France on August 3rd. Once this happened, Great Britain decided that they should declare war on Germany. So now everyone got involved. The Central Powers were named that because they were predominantly in the center of Europe. Those powers were Germany and Austria-Hungary. Later on, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire will also join these Central Powers. The Allies were France, Great Britain, and Russia. Later on in the war, Japan, the United States, and Italy will also join the Allies. Italy used to be partners with Germany before the war, but they thought that they had unjustly started the war, so they switched sides. By the late summer of 1914, millions of happy soldiers were marching to what they believed to be a short, quick war. Here you see a map of those countries. At first, it's just Germany and Austria-Hungary. Later on, Bulgaria, and down here you see part of the Ottoman Empire will join forces. Countries in blue are neutral. That's Spain, Switzerland as always, and mainly the Daneland states. The Triple Entente was Russia, France, the United Kingdom, which is Great Britain, and later on Italy and other people will join in as well. A bloody stalemate. At first, it was a very rapid war. Germany invaded France, and first they invaded Luxembourg and Belgium. Had a very good job, bowed through with very low casualties. Later on, they moved into France, and they rushed into France and took huge tracts of territory there. However, by the fall of that year, a stalemate was reached on the battlefields of France. This became known as the Western Front. Here's how that stalemate happened. A man by the name of General Alfred von Schlieffen came up with a plan in the late 1800s on how to win a two-front war. So if Germany had to face France and Russia, this was the best way to do it. The only way that it could defeat two countries at once, being attacked from both sides, was to rapidly attack and defeat France in the west, and then take all of its soldiers, put them on trains, and rapidly deploy them back to the east to fight Russia. The reason for this is that they figured it would take Russia several weeks to mobilize and get their forces to the German border because they lacked railroads. So this is the plan they put into action during World War I. By late September, German forces had swept all over France and were on the outskirts of Paris. And in these days, if you took the capital, you took over that country. Here's the Schlieffen Plan in action. And right here you see Germany. What the Schlieffen Plan was supposed to happen was these would all be different columns or divisions of infantrymen. They would sweep through Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg here, while a distractionary force delayed the French here. French had a huge defensive plan here with trenches, bunkers, and everything else. This is where they thought the main German offensive would come from. So this is where they stationed all their troops. They never thought that Germany would come in through the back door this way and through these neutral countries. That's exactly what Germany did. They came in here with these troops here. Now, this is what the plan called for. A huge big sweep wagon wheel, and then these outside forces would attack around and cut off Paris, while these ones would take Paris, and while these ones would hook in and box these two groups in and fight on both sides. Had this plan been enacted correctly, it might have won the war. However, what happened is these two columns here didn't attack this far uh, to the west. They actually attacked closer here, didn't even go into Holland at all, only Belgium and Luxembourg. And then this was their outermost flank right here. And instead of going to Paris and attacking it, they got right in front of Paris, and then they hooked too early, leaving the capital alone. So what happens is the Germans move in. They do a very good job of taking over Belgium and Luxembourg and marching into France. However, the Allies are able to regroup and counterattack northeast of Paris in what is known as the Marne Valley. During this time, they needed reinforcements at the front line to stop the German attack, but they didn't have any troop carriers to bring them there. So they actually employed a fleet of 600 taxis to rush reinforcements from Paris to the front line. After 4 days of fighting, the Germans were forced to retreat. This left the Schlieffen Plan in ruins. Also, Russia was able to mobilize quicker than anticipated, and they invaded Germany. Now Germany was stuck fighting a two-front war, something they did not want to do, so they had to take troops that were fighting in France, rapidly deploy them to the east to defeat the Russians, or at least keep them at bay. It's about this point that the Allies dig in northern France. By dig in, I mean to make a series of trenches. The Germans retreat back a mile, and in some places less, and they dig parallel trenches. So now both sides are digging in defensive positions. And by 1915, both armies on the Western Front had dug miles of parallel trenches to protect each other from enemy fire. There were large losses of life at this time with small gain. There's a big problem in World War I. There is brand new weapons technology that causes massive amounts of casualties. You have machine guns that can fire thousands of rounds a minute. You have poison gas that can kill people and you won't even know it's there until somebody's choking. You've got artillery rounds that can be fired from miles away with pinpoint accuracy, with all types of different rounds to shred people up. So you take all of those new technologies. You also have to factor into the equation that the generals in charge are stuck in the old way of thinking, which is I see your army, you see mine, we charge at each other, one of us runs away, the other one is the winner. It's not how it worked anymore. When you're charging in formation, in rows, in lines, at a machine gun, all it has to do is traverse from left to right, and it can mow down entire companies without even a barrel change. These generals were so stuck in that old mindset that they wastefully and needlessly slaughtered hundreds, thousands, and upwards into the millions by the end of the war of people by simply not adapting to the new style of tactics and the new weapons there. Life in the trenches was terrible. There was mud everywhere. There was a lack of fresh food on the front lines. Very hard to sleep. Even when you were in your dugout, so you'd have your trench and you'd dig a little hole into the wall where you and your buddies would sleep, or at least try to. It wasn't very pleasant. They were constantly having artillery shells coming down, shaking the earth. There were cave-ins, gas attacks with your gas mask. Very terrible. There were snipers everywhere. People were constantly trying to invade and call into your trench. You always had to be on guard. Death was everywhere. Plus, there are rats everywhere, so there's disease. And since you're in mud, it's raining, it's wet, and you don't change your socks enough, you get what's known as trench foot, where your foot actually starts to rot inside of your boot. Going out of the trenches wasn't much fun either. This was called no man's land because this was a terrible place in between trenches and many people died. Machine guns cut people down, artillery shells would blow up, blow people to pieces. They could hit the trenches too. The trenches went from 500 miles all the way to the North Sea to neutral Switzerland, all dug by hand by troops. Alright, here you see a picture of some soldiers in the trench. These are British soldiers. You can tell by the type of helmet that they wear. You can see here down at the bottom, it's wet, it's muddy, it's damp, not a very fun place to be. Here you see some of the battles, but what I want to point out is here is one of your trench lines, all the way down. And then here you see, over here, you see the trench line going all the way down. The blue is the German trench. This purple color here is the Allied trench, not very far from one another in some places. And it ran all the way down. And then you see other battles that happened. If you want to take a look at that, you can leave it up here for a minute, so you can see some of the Allied and Central Power advances and attacks and counterattacks during the war. Here, once again, you can tell that these are British troops by their helmet, and this is the type of machine gun you would have, very similar to the Maxim gun that we had studied in other chapters. Belt fed, usually operated by two people, and this is where the bullets come out here. This tube here is hooked up to water. That's going to cool the barrel so it doesn't overheat. There's some of the artillery pieces I was talking about. The shells that they would have were huge, weighing upwards of 100-pound apiece, flying through the air, and it wasn't like just a big giant lead bullet coming at you. Some of it would explode in the ground, some would explode above ground. They would have different chemicals into them and other incendiary devices, depending on what their intent was. New weapons, talked about a few of them already. You had machine guns, poison gas, you had armored tanks. At first, the armored tanks weren't used properly. They were only used a few at a time, and they weren't supported by the infantry, and they were easily picked off by artillery. Later on, when they used tanks en masse and supported by infantry, they became one of the reasons that trench warfare ended. The large artillery pieces that we've talked about already make it a not fast-moving war, a very defensive war, where a few people are dying, but they're dying constantly. One or two people a day here, one or two people a day there. Very, very bloody battles. In February of 1916, the Germans decided to attack at the French town of Verdun. By the time the battle is over, 300,000 were killed on each side. That's one battle, a few months in 1916. In the Civil War, the United States' worst, bloodiest war with the most deaths and casualties on each side, the North and South suffered a combined total of 600,000. That was throughout the entire 4 years of that war. This is one battle, a few months, and that's already been reached. The British then attacked the Germans northwest of Verdun at the Somme River. This is the bloodiest and worst day for Britain during this war. In it, 20,000 soldiers, British soldiers, are killed in the first day of fighting alone. These are massive amounts of casualties and deaths in small amounts of time because of that equation that I talked about earlier. New technology and old tactics, and they're not mixing. Here you see a picture of a gas attack. Now the problem with gas is, well, obviously it's terrible. It's going to choke the person. It can cause blindness. It can cause death. But as you can see, it's moving in the wind. You could shoot your canisters of gas at the enemy, and then if the wind changes, now the gas might be coming back at you. And if you don't have your gas mask readily available, you will be in some trouble. There are some soldiers, and they're loading a gas mask. These are French troops. You can tell by their helmets. These helmets look similar to a firefighter helmet that was the French design at the time. It's a very primitive gas mask. It's basically just a piece of cloth over your face and some goggles. Here are some British troops who are running through a gas attack, and you can see their gas mask. A little bit better than the French version there. You have it here. This would be hooked up to a filter, which they're carrying here. It's hot, it's sweaty, very miserable inside a gas mask. So this is not a fun way to fight. Here's a picture of one of the tanks. Different than we have today, but you see the treads here. Got a few cannon pieces on the side. Very slow moving and bulking, but eventually it will play a major part in the war. This is what would happen to them at first sometimes. Many times they would get stuck in trenches and ditches, rendering them useless or immobile, and the troops would run out and hopefully not get killed by the enemy. The Somme River ends in November. Each side had taken 500,000 casualties. At Verdun, the Germans gained 4 miles. At the Somme, the Brits gained 5 miles. So, lots of death, lots of destruction, not much territory gained. And we'll stop there, and we'll talk about the battles on the Eastern Front next time.